I spent some time in the peat swamp forests of Borneo studying wild orangutan. We would go into the forest very early around 4 a.m. One morning there was a clouded leopard on the trail we used to enter the forest. It was just crouched there watching us. We shouted. Tried to act big. One of the indigenous people we worked with even took out his slingshot and shot rocks at it. He missed on purpose, just trying to scare it off. It stayed there for a good 5 minutes watching us before it slowly walked into the thick brush off the cleared trail. When we walked by, I shined my light to where it had walked to and could clearly see a pair of reflective eyes only 3 meters away, crouched watching us pass. Creepy, but also incredibly cool to see one in person for how critically endangered they are. Type. Working late at night on a remote mine site. Changing out a switch in a substation on the edge of the pit. Just me and a quiet room full of gently humming transformers. I finish up and head for the door, and I see 3 pairs of red eyes staring through the window. Nothing else visible. Just blackness and 3 sets of red eyes. Turns out goats' eyes reflect red at night. And they like staring in windows. I've worked in Canada's north for a few years now in oil and gas. It's pretty creepy when during night shift you realize a moose has just been standing at the tree line staring you down for an unknown length of time. Or finding bear tracks crossing the tracks you just made 5 minutes ago. Honestly, the silence of a snowy forest in the dead of night, hundreds of km away from anything, is pretty spooky. When your only contact to the outside world is a radio channel nobody's listening to. You feel pretty alone. I was a field geologist in the outback about 12 hours north of Adelaide. One day I was driving the truck and saw what looked like a flagpole sticking up in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't anywhere near a farm or anywhere else that people would be. So I decided to drive over and check it out. It was a dead dog fully impaled on a spike. Like, from butt to mouth. Took some pictures and had my boss call the cops. But for the rest of the assignment I was freaked out that some maniac was out there with me. I don't know if it was a domestic dog or a dingo or something. It was pretty well decayed when I found it. Second. I'm not sharing the pictures. Please stop asking. I used to work in the Gulf of Mexico on oil rigs for years. And it may not exactly be creepy. But I found it really unsettling. In deep, open water. The water itself is really clear. So everyone can plainly see all the tuna and barracudas hanging around the rig waiting for the onboard cook to throw off whatever food waste he needs to. Every once in a while a huge great white shark would swim up from underneath and snatch a tuna, and it really took like less than a second. They're really scary. Not my story, but a close friend. He used to deliver newspapers in his Jeep CJ7. Which was lifted and had long throw headlights for when he would go camping, off-roading in it. He would be up as early as 3 a.m. to do his rural route. So he would be alert for deer and other wildlife that might try to cross the road in front of him. He was also big into cryptozoology. He believed in Bigfoot and other cryptids. So his mind was in that zone a lot on those mornings. One early morning he was driving slowly through a curve alongside a pasture when he heard an inhuman wail. He slowed down, and as he came out of the curve his headlights lit up a pair of eyes that had to be 10 feet off the ground. He stopped, backed up and tried to get his lights to illuminate whatever it was. He heard the wail again coming from the direction of the eyes, and he started freaking out. Thinking he finally saw Bigfoot. As he was scrambling for his camera, his eyes adjusted enough to realize what he was actually looking at. The eyes were a bull's, and he was high off the ground because he was currently mounting a cow. Which is where the wails came from. Our friend group ribbed him incessantly for that over the years. And any time one of us would see him, we'd ask if he found Bigfoot yet. I spent several seasons working at a remote field camp in Antarctica. Over 1,000 kilometers from the main station in McMurdo. Everyone once in a while. A skua bird or Antarctic tern would accidentally end up following one of the small planes twin otter out to our camp. Once there though, they'd basically be stranded with no way to get back to the coast. I'd get out of my tent some mornings and see a lonely tern circling overhead. knowing it was a dead bird flying. It was quite creepy. Along these lines. When birds or seals do die down there, it's so cold and dry that their bodies don't decay either. They essentially mummify. Outside McMurdo at Scott's Discovery Hut, there is still a perfectly preserved seal carcass from 1912 sitting by the entrance of the hut. Working on ships. There was one night I was on a ship sailing through Alaskan waters. And it happened to be my first night ever seeing northern lights. I can't believe how awesome that was. It made the sky clear. Made the night look like it was dusk. We were able to see clearly for miles. Few buddies and I hit the roof or what we call Lido deck at 1 a.m. just to gaze at it. An hour or so in. There was 6 of us on top. Nearly the entire crew now. A big white spotlight shines at us. We were near land. But where the spotlight was above the water, and it wasn't low enough to be on a ship. This was very high up. It shined on us for about 15 to 20 seconds. Once the light turned off, we looked to see what it was. Saw nothing. No trace of an aircraft or anything. Couple minutes go by and the same light shined on us. This time it was on the other side of our vessel. Above mountains. Still. Unable to see what it was. We all saw it. We all have never seen any aircrafts hovering above these waters. Especially at 2 a.m. We don't know what it was. We think it might have been some sort of silenced aircraft the military was probably doing drills or something. But anyways. That was one of the weirder things to happen out on the ocean. I was the creepy occurrence, and #X200B. I live on a ranch off of a quite dirt road. Our distant neighbor's nearest house is about 1 mile away, as the crow flies have had issues with people stealing things out of their outbuildings and storage sheds in the area. It was also late in the year. So it was starting to get dark around 6 p.m. So as a result, every time I would see headlights go down our road, I would watch to make sure they weren't stopping on the property. One evening I see a vehicle going very slowly down the road and come to a stop at the end of our driveway about 120 yards from our front porch. The vehicle is parked right in front of a 60s pickup I have parked. So I think whoever it is might be looking to steal it. Or just looking over the property. Whatever the case, I decide to put on a black coat and grab my rifle to go investigate. It's dark out. So I stay out of the headlights of the vehicle so I can get close. I can tell it is a white van. But I don't see anything else distinguishing about the van. When I'm about 50 yards away, the van backs up and turns into our driveway. I freeze as the headlights wash across me standing in the middle of my driveway. And I see the reflective FedEx logos on the side of the van. Needless to say, the FedEx driver probably shit his pants as he suddenly sees a dark figure standing in the middle of a field. In the dark. Holding a rifle. Surprisingly, after I try to give a friendly wave and smile, he continues up the driveway to the house. And I get to explain the situation and we both have a laugh. So that's how I got to be the creepy guy in some FedEx delivery driver's story. My parents live pretty far back in the country and have one neighboring house. The neighbors would let their basset hound outside for about 10 minutes to use the bathroom every morning. One morning they let him out. And he didn't come back inside. After a couple minutes they walked out to his favorite bathroom spot. And found his head. Judging from the tracks, a mountain lion had ambushed him and apparently torn his head off before carrying the body away. What I thought was the creepiest part was that the family hadn't heard a sound. I used to do agricultural work. Alone in a field for 10 hours a day kinda thing. The pure amount of times I heard the sound of running and snapped up to see literally nothing there was horrific. I was convinced it was surely animals between the trees for a while, but the weirdest moment was when I heard it loudly from a row of trees next to me and immediately ducked under to see the feet of whatever animal was running by, and there was absolutely nothing. I remember trying to stay calm and walking really fast to the toilet block and sitting in there for a good long while before I came back. I never thought I'd be so freaked out in the daytime, but there wasn't a soul nearby for quite a way and it really amped up my imagination. In my brief stint as a rural health nurse, I was quite unnerved by how many of the families I worked with still practiced ritual animal sacrifice, even though on paper they identify as Catholic. Merchant seaman here. Nothing particularly creepy. Most of the time you're too focused on not hitting anything, getting position fixes, updating logbooks, etc., to really think about paranormal or spoopy shit. But the closest thing to creepy I've experienced recently has been a strange transmission over the radio. It started with a series of Morse code beeps followed by an accented female voice listing off random letters and numbers. Dunno what the fuck that was about. I should clarify. It was definitely numbers station Y. And obviously radio propagation is a thing. But this was off the Gulf of Mexico on a hot-ass day. We have a PTO pump spot that comes out of a canal for our rice fields. When I was like 12 years old, my uncle found 2 bodies dumped in the little sump area where our pump sat. Both of the ladies that were dumped there had the same tattoo, so they think it was gang-related, but it was 45 minutes away from where that gang operated. I still look in the hole every time I go by there, and that was 20 years ago. I worked night shift at a prison for years. The one thing that really creeps you out is when a hit is put on someone in the middle of the night. Inmates' code says it is kept as quiet as possible. No one says a damn word. The only thing you'll hear are grunts and moans from the victims. Then it goes and stays silent. If you hear it happening, it's already too late to stop it. It'll be over before you pull your keys out. Occasionally, if someone needs medical attention, the first sign we got was an inmate approaching the bars saying they need to go to medical and are usually bleeding, all nonchalant. The creepy ones are where no one shows up. All you get is grunts of pain, and that's it. I do a lot of work out in the woods. Creepiest thing was finding some headless doves. I also found sticks arranged in circles and paint on the trees in the same spot. Not sure if it was part of a ritual or not. But that's what I saw. Okay, lots of great points that it could have been just wildlife or cats catching the doves. That's totally possible. I've seen cats do that before too. To add some more context, the type of doves found were not native to this area. It's possible they escaped or were released and had a run-in with a hungry house cat. And the painted circle of trees and sticks nearby was coincidence. Who knows? I certainly don't know what really happened, so it's all speculation. It's still the weirdest, creepiest thing I've ever found. Spent a summer doing conservation work out in the absolute middle of nowhere in Wyoming. Was part of a crew that would spend 2 weeks camping in remote places to do manual labor in places machines couldn't get to. For this story, we were building new biking trails in the back portion of a designated wilderness area in a high-altitude desert. This means that the nearest civilization was a 2-hour car ride to a town of 41 people in a sandy soil area where tracks last forever. It was the middle of our stint during the early part of the night where everyone else had gone to bed, but I stayed up to read. So maybe 11:30 or so. Still pitch black outside. Clouds had covered stars. So my headlamp was probably the only light on in a 40-mile radius. Suddenly I hear footsteps walking around our camp and head towards the tents from where I was in the community tent. That sound immediately put me on edge as I felt the hair on my arms raise and my adrenaline spike. I recall thinking to myself that 2 things are very wrong, since the person was not using a light to see and the footsteps were not coming towards me from the tents. Rather, it was the opposite. Within the 4 seconds it took me to drop my book, get up, and turn the corner of the tent to cast my light on the sleeping tents. The sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in dirt before me. Looked like they came from one end of camp. Looked into my tent. Walked through the sleeping tents and kept going out of camp again. I don't know if I was making too much noise or not by walking around. But the rest of my crew ended up waking up and asking me what was going on from inside their tents. After explaining what I found, they all got up to look at the boot prints in the dirt. They were damn near perfect copies of my own boots except for one small thing. I had a rock stuck in my treads that messed up the symmetry. I was wearing fairly common work boots. Except I also happened to wear US size 15 double-wide boots. So there was no way in hell this was one of the other crew members. I don't think any of us slept much that night. Never saw or heard anything more after that night. A light rain removed the tracks a couple days later. But I do remember none of us were willing to step on the prints themselves and choose to step over them like cracks in the sidewalk. I was serving as a fireman for my nation's compulsory national service. Once, we were called into the forest to retrieve a body who was found hanging on a noose deep along one of the running trails. He had apparently committed suicide by hanging himself off a tree. Was found by a few morning joggers. What's creepy was, we found a straw doll at the foot of the tree. It was stabbed with a few red bobby pins in the head, facial area. And there was also an unknown talisman that was half burnt where the doll was sitting. When we took the body down, we had to carry him a few kilometers out of the forest, and halfway along the journey, a previously unnoticed wound on his face started bleeding. One of my men sweared that it was bleeding from the same spot as where the bobby pin was stuck on the doll, but we could not confirm it as we left the doll where his body was found. For the police, passed the body to the paramedics and booked our way out of the area. Wow, thank you for the upvotes and the award. Glad that everyone enjoyed the story. Yes, this happened in Southeast Asia, where almost all religion exists here. I used to be a delivery driver. Which doesn't sound very remote because it isn't. However, I did have to deliver to some pretty remote places. One time I delivered to a trailer park just barely inside our designated delivery zone, and it was very dark and poorly lit. I leave my car running and keep the headlights and inside lights on to go deliver the pizza. Upon returning to my car, I sit down in the driver's seat and look up to see a creepy old man standing less than 3 feet from my side of the car. He was just staring. It was the equivalent of a jump scare. I just started driving forward. Had to do a U-turn to get out of the park. When I turned around, the man was standing in the middle of the road. So I freaked out for a second before speeding around him, only to watch him attempt to chase my car out of the trailer park. I put in my 2 weeks after that. I'm not sure if this counts because it's a farm, but when you live on a farm you work on a farm, so I guess I'll tell it. I grew up on a farm and in high school used to mess with my friends by hiding and making them find me. One night my friend was over and we were waiting on this other guy. We see him pull up, so we take off running to hide. It's funny because they have to wander around somewhere they're unfamiliar with or go ask my parents and be told, too bad, you'll have to find her. It's like forced hide and seek. Anyway, this one night I saw my friend hide in one building while I ran for the trees. I was hiding under some bushes and heard breathing. Like human breathing. There were no animals around. It creeped me out so bad I ran out of hiding to greet my friend. I felt so uncomfortable for the rest of the night. Sometime during the night my dad heard something and went out to investigate. In the morning he discovered that one of our cows was killed and butchered. I worked in a store once in a really small town that was always absolutely dead. A customer every hour or so. Shifts all alone too, which I'm sure wasn't even legal, but hey. Anyway, it's a dark evening and I'm sat on Reddit as usual when I hear the door open. I look up and see the back of a man as he begins walking down the first aisle towards the tin foods, and he appears to be talking to someone on the phone. I think nothing of it and go back to Reddit. All of a sudden I get this intense smell of soil and earth. I look up and the man's approaching the counter and he's wearing some kind of overalls and his face and long gray hair and body is just covered in dirt. That's when I notice he isn't on the phone at all and is just talking to himself in this absolutely bizarre tone. He sounded like a cartoon elf or something. He's just sort of murmuring and doing this really weird hee-hee sort of laugh. I'm just frozen solid. As he stood at the counter in front of me thinking I'm about to be killed when a policeman storms through the door. He asks if I'm okay, to which I don't respond because I'm just in a complete state of what the fuck is happening. tells the man to come outside, to which he starts murmuring gibberish and saying the words legal over and over again. They come grab the man and put him in the back of the police car, and that's the last I ever heard of it. I have no idea who he was. What was going on, but I have never been so afraid of another person before. You know when you just sense a bad situation. So grateful the police showed up when they did. A two-headed snake in a Congolese forest. I've been fishing out in the Gulf of Mexico where they have some oil rigs. This rig wasn't being used from what we knew, so we would get pretty close to it to fish for red snapper. While we were out there, we could have sworn we heard screams of a woman over and over. It was some shit, but the explanation was the wind making the noises as it blew through the rig. Well, that's what we were told, but it totally creeped us the fuck out. Some friends and I were fishing a small pond just after dark for catfish. We started to hear sounds coming off the water like someone throwing softball-sized rocks. But they were coming from all over the pond. We thought someone was messing with us and we called out a few times for them to stop. But we eventually got freaked out and left. Cut to a few years later. I'm fishing a different pond and hear the same sound. Turns out it was a beaver slapping its tail on the water to drive me from its territory. When beavers become problems in rivers, they relocate them to ponds in town. Used to teach outdoor education, which was essentially just summer camp during the school year, and school groups would come up and spend a few days at the camp. On their last night we would always tell them a scary story around the campfire. It was the same scary story every time. We worked in partners, so there were always 2 staff members for every school group. One staff member would tell the story and the other staff member would go hide in the forest and make scary noises. So, I'm telling the story and every few minutes there's like a snap of a twig or rustling in the bushes, and of course as always the kids all get freaked out and they start getting scared. It's very fun. Well, as I'm telling a story I'm walking around the campfire looking at all the kids' faces and I noticed a familiar one. My partner Eric. Sitting there smiling at me, wondering why I'm staring at him. My heart has never started beating so fast in my life. Eventually I sped through the story and all the kids left, and I explained to Eric that I thought it was him in the woods, and his eyes got very wide and he said, "Are you telling me that that wasn't one of the staff members?" So we both ran back to the main road. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge, where they had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, etc. and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about 1/2 mile from the main camp. But we took them a circuitous route that made it seem really secluded. Anyways. On this one night all the campers had made their shelters. We had cooked dinner. And were all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late. Maybe 11 o'clock. So I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard in the distance what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint. But myself and my fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes. Ringing every 30 seconds. Or so. We were all a little creeped out. As there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bells stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words. But it sounded like church choir music. But a lot of people. And a lot more enthusiastic. Also. It was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour. Sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it. Sometimes getting so loud we thought it was getting closer. All of the campers were super creeped out. But I lied to them. Telling them there was a church service going on in camp. And that there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually. At almost 1 a.m. the singing stopped. I found out a few days later that there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night. And that's what we had heard. Spent a summer in Wyoming going to BLM land and other remote locations collecting data on bats and herpetofauna. Heard a lot of weird noises like mountain lions screaming, deer snorting, What sounded like owls fighting. Woke up one morning to find 2 bull moose sleeping 20 yards behind my tent. All of this was part of the job, until one night a truck was driving towards us when we were on a BLM square in the southwestern part of the state. The truck was going overland. No road and was slowly driving at us. It stopped about 100 yards away. Turned off the lights and we could see a person get out. They walked a full circle around us at approximately 100 yards away. Got back in the truck and turned around. This was after dark and this shadowy figure did a complete circle around us. You could hear them walking through the sagebrush and I'm sure they could hear us talking. We packed up after that and drove to a hotel an hour away. I called the office and told them I was taking a gun when we went back out. Didn't like having the bear mace as our only defense. BLM stands for Bureau of Land Management. I was on a boat sitting on anchor in a secluded bay in the early hours. In southeast Alaska a few years ago. I stepped outside for a smoke and all of a sudden I heard the most horrific sounds of a wild animal being murdered by another wild animal. It went on for probably 10 minutes. I know it's just nature but man. I can still hear that sound in my brain and it haunts me. You guys. This is my highest voted comment of all time. Beating out my post of a boiled yam in our shitty food porn. Not me but a coworker. Used to work at a piggery. She said she would always see someone in the corner of her eyes. Boards would be written up like someone was checking on her sows for her. Things cleaned up. Like someone was helping her. Apparently she thought she was going mad and described seeing a dude around and the others said, "Oh yeah, we think that's blank. He died a while back at home." All the staff had seen him but just sort of ignored it. I work as a polar bear guard. As in, I escort people across tundra and mountains and protect them from polar bears. I once saw a snowman totem with reindeer antlers coming out of his head. It was deformed. Full of bullet holes and rather creepy. I'm in the Navy and work on aircraft carriers. A girl sadly hung herself in one of the spaces right near where me and my shop slept. One person swore he saw her sitting in the chair as he was getting undressed one day and ran screaming out of the berthing. I waited about a week to go into the space where she hung herself and when I did I heard the loudest screeching noise I had ever heard in my life. I quickly turned around and got the fuck out of there. The system connected to where she slept didn't work at all for the next 2 weeks or so too. The systems break a lot so it was pretty coincidental that it happened just as she did this. Mostly just a lot of tweaker bullshit. But there was a time when I was hiking in a wilderness area and saw a bunch of trash bags hidden under some trees about a quarter mile off trail. About 10 miles from the nearest road. Noped out of there pretty quick. My biggest fear at work is finding a body in the woods. I work for a medical examiner and used to be on the graveyard shift alone. The first night I was on at midnight on the dot our air system shut off which caused the vents to warp. That shit sounded like somebody running through the vents in the ceiling on all fours. Thankfully I got used to it lol but def creepy at first. Another night we lost power and stupid me watching a horror movie working so hard almost shit my pants when everything went dark and knowing that a room with around 30 dead bodies in it was walking distance away. That one I stayed in my car for. Not to mention the constant long dark red lit hallways. Glad I'm not on overnight now. I used to work in the oil field for a company that sold oil tools for drilling and fracking companies to rent in Bridgeport, Texas. Our yard was next to a women's prison. We shared a fence with them. Sometimes when the ladies would be out on the yard they could see us working on our trucks or just doing random tasks and they would try to flirt with us and show us their tits and shit and sometimes we would see a fight. Some nights I would get back to the yard really late and it was definitely against the rules for the women to be out in their yard after dark. A couple nights I got back at like 11 p.m. and I was the only one at the yard. I parked my truck all the way in the back like always. And one night specifically as I was walking away from my truck somebody whistled at me. It wasn't faint at all, like it was a very loud and clear flirtatious whistle. You know the one. Like the generic whistle that people do when they see someone they think is attractive. That woot, phew, whistle. I don't know how else to describe it. But anyway, it creeper me TF out, especially when I looked back and there was nobody there, but it sounded so close. About a week later I got back to the yard late as fuck again, and I was still creeped out by what had happened the week prior. Well, I parked my truck in the same place and started walking away, and I'll be damned if I didn't hear the exact whistle again. I looked back and there was no one to be seen, so I yelled out, "Who's there?" And just dead silence. I picked up my flashlight and shined it at the dark corner of the fence where it was coming from and couldn't see anything. Then I turned around and saw a dark figure standing on the opposite side of the yard in the back, where there is never anything or any reason to be back there, plus it was way too late for anyone else to be at our yard. I yelled out, "Hey! What are you doing?" And they just climbed over the fence back to the side of the prison. Over the fucking razor wire. And into the darkness. I told my boss the next day, and he said he think he's seen somebody back there at night too, but he never looked into it. Oh, still get so weirded out when I think about it. I'm a machinist and I was working by myself in this old warehouse at night. I would see stuff moving around and I would get creeper out. This is when ghost hunters became popular. So I started to ask questions. What's your name? Can you show me that I'm not alone? Seconds later a 3/8 Allen wrench came bouncing across the shop and landed at my feet. It didn't fall of the machine, it slid. I was cutting micarta, which is like wood. And you could see the slid marks in the chips. I said thank you to the ghost. Shut down and left. I never went back. I used to work as an alligator hunting guide for trophy hunters during my summers. South of New Orleans. Spending sunup to sundown deep in the heart of Cajun swamp territory definitely left me seeing some weird and creepy things. The first one that comes to mind is when I saw what my hunting partner at the time called the loup-garou. I personally would have called it a chupacabra, but that's because I'm a native of the Southwest. Not the South. We were riding through an area deep in the swamp looking for signs of a big gator. The banks were close on both sides of the boat, there was barely enough water for us to push ahead. But those mud boats are impressive and can practically run on dry land, so onwards we pressed. Suddenly, I saw a gray flash in the trees out of the corner of my eye. It made me nervous. Swamp deer are small and shy. There's not many mammals that want to hang out in thick undergrowth and knee-deep mud and hidden gators. I tapped my partner's shoulder to catch his attention over the sound of the motor and pointed in the direction I saw the flash. He cut the motor and asked if it was a gator slide. I shook my head and said I had no idea what it was, but I saw something. As we were looking around us, the creature I saw stepped out from the trees. It was big. On all fours. With mottled gray skin. Its movements were janky. Jerky. It had a canine-like face and it locked eyes with me, and I felt sick to my stomach. My partner immediately struck the motor back up and we reversed out of there as quickly as we could. My rational brain said, poor creature with mange. Either a massive coyote or maybe a wild dog, but my primal monkey brain was screeching, monster. Run. Or die. It was definitely a freaky experience. Even knowing what it probably was. Biologist. Lots of time in remote areas. 1. Meth labs. Often tucked away in absentee landowner property. Usually some POS RV. 2. Meth houses. Homes that were clearly abandoned greater than 40 years ago but clearly occupied within the last 5. If not currently. I got curious a few times and poked around inside. But didn't push too much because they would have heard me in the brush long before I got inside the house. I'd see drug stuff. Porn. Junk food. Mattresses drug in on the floor. Think of the row houses in Amsterdam in The Wire. 3. 2 of my colleagues have found dead bodies. They were all illegal immigrants crossing north into the U.S. Most accidents. One was a gunshot. I've been in areas with unsolved murders. I just tread lightly with the locals. Think of the Ozark TV show Point 4. More sad than creepy. But abandoned graveyards. Dozens of them. Locals try to keep up, but there is a natural progression of decline and neglect until they're outright forgotten. It's sad to see a bunch of graves of kids from 1900 that all died within a few weeks of each other. More anti-vaxxers ought to see those. Point 5. I got shot at once. Point 6. I stumbled into a herd of feral hogs. At night. In really tall cattails. That was more frightening than the snakes. Alligators. Etc. I couldn't see them, but they were freaking out that I was there. 7. I've seen a few shrines of pagans or whatever. But they're pretty harmless and don't leave any permanent damage to anything. No harm, no foul. Point 8. A guy in the front yard of his trailer house. Deep in the woods in a swamp. Shitting in a 5-gallon bucket. Very awkward eye contact. Honestly. Not much out there is creepy, without a human element thrown in. Actually, I don't work in remote places. But when my father was sent to Alwar, Rajasthan for archaeological study, I encountered a very strange thing. Our house was near a small forest. One morning I saw a group of blue bulsa kind of Asian antelope. They were 5 in number. And they were running in circles around a skull for like 30 minutes, and then one of them took it into the forest and they all followed him silently. It was such a weirdo sight. It still gives me creeps. I know a forest ranger who regularly stays at these remote cabin fire tower outposts. She'll wake up in the morning and look out the window to soak in the landscape only to see influencers posing for photos. When I was 15 years old, I was doing my 4 a.m. newspaper delivery round on bicycle. I was driving into the garden of this one subscriber where I saw 2 guys with flashlights looking through the windows of the house. I was a bit in shock and just said, "Good morning, guys." They were just as much in shock, and an awkward silence followed. I tried to break the silence by asking if I could pass them to deliver the newspaper through the door. One of the guys said the person living in that house did something to his family and they took it as an opportunity to get away in their car that was still running. When they were gone, I rang the doorbell at the house to tell them what happened and they should keep an eye out. We were wrapping up for the day in northern Canada. I am fueling up the side boom. I am all by myself at this point cause I was tired of listening to the laborers whine of the cold, so I told them I would take care of the rest. Think bulldozer with no blade but a giant metal boom on the side that we use to razor and lower pipe. It's February, so pitch black. I keep hearing some weird sound. I can't quite hear it cause the pump is too loud. I search around a couple times and see nothing. I get in the truck and take off, drive past the front of the side boom to see a cougar sitting on top of a dirt pile 15 feet away. The damned thing was just watching me there and probably could have ended me without me even realizing it. I've never seen a cougar in the wild before, and it's hard to understand just how big they are and how powerful until you see one up close. That thing leapt off the 6-foot pile and probably didn't touch ground for 15 to 20 feet. It's terrifying to think something so big and powerful could just be sitting there deciding if they want to make you dinner. My story isn't exactly what was asked for, but should be good padding while this post is so new. In middle school, I worked at the school during the summer, doing general painting and helping the maintenance guys. We had to drive out to the fuck-off middle of a Floridian forest to pick up some pine lumber for the gym's new bleachers. And when we got to the mill at like 7 a.m., the whole place was locked down with police. They had found gasoline cans and pill bottles out in one of the tree farm groves. Telltale signs of kids abusing substances. But supposedly the cops were there because they found human remains. I was pretty young and I don't remember anything outside of my little kid point of view. But I remember seeing streaks of dark blood running up the trunks of several pines. I've since learned from the guys I was with then that a teenager was killed by a bear after attacking it. And the blood was either from the wounded bear climbing the tree or dragging a hurt person up with it. But I'm sure many of you can agree with me that bears don't do that. And I can't see an injured bear macking it up several pines in a row while bleeding that much. So, technically, I saw a creepy thing while at work in a remote area. Look up Lakeland Mill casualties or something to find it. The story of the kid's death was in the local paper. Although it's not really work. I do go hunting kinda north in Canada. And the thing is, where I hunt for deer there are plenty of wolves, bears and the sorts. So I stay in a cabin up there. You aren't always on your toes. But you want to bring a rifle with you to go anywhere. Even if you don't plan on shooting anything. So it's like 5 a.m. And I'm on the four-wheeler. I'm freezing weather to get to my tree stand before dawn hits, and I swear to God I keep hearing crashing through the bushes. I dismiss it for probably being ice cracking the branches from last night's snow. But creepy. Nonetheless. As I reached my stand. I climb up and settle for the morning. I get a pretty nice view of a field that was cleared out. And there is a old burned-out cottage on the opposite end of the clearing. As the sun rises behind my stand. The morning is very still. Just the occasional branch falling down through the forest. Day really passed without any ammo being spent, and I get out of my tree stand. And decide maybe I should go look at the burned-down cabin. I've never bothered checking it. And looking at it all day got me curious enough to go check it out. There wasn't a cleared trail. Obviously, so I'd have to go it on foot. I unloaded my rifle and went for a long walk. Around a good 10 minutes later I started to get close and could see some old farm equipment. Which made sense. A field in the middle of the forest was probably cleared so a farmer could do what he wants with it. I come close to the doorway. Only really able to hear the crunch of snow underneath my feet. The doorway managed to survive whatever happened there and slid down the snow in through the doorway. Careful not to touch anything. And I feel crunch under my boots that definitely isn't snow. It's the skull of a bull. I look up from the snow and there is more of them. Skulls and legs. A ridiculous amount. But the part that alarmed me is that I could see a tint of red in the snow underneath one that was still covered in skin, so I said fuck that and bolted back across the field and didn't look back. Why was someone collecting that shit in the middle of the forest? I don't have a clue. And don't want to think about it. Next year I moved my stand and I never want to go back there. Weird shit happens in the forest. My mom used to live in a small town in the Cascade Mountains and worked as a forest ranger. The creepiest thing that happened was when the oldest male ranger kept hitting on her and trying to get her to come home with him. Not very out of the ordinary. But many years later, after she'd left the town, she found out he had been convicted of manslaughter and had killed a young female ranger right before she got hired. She would have probably been his next target. Removed. Lived up north for a while on a 3-year job. A local took me way out into the woods one night because he swore that at midnight at this one spot you could see the ghostly carriage where some people froze to death. Obviously expected to see nothing. So we're sitting there in absolute pitch black darkness. You can't see your hand in front of your face or anything around you. The sky is slightly gray from the thin cloud cover reflecting distant lights, but that's it. You can't even really make out the tree line. We never do see a carriage. Or anything. At about 12:20 or so we're just smoking and chatting. Thinking about leaving. When we hear the unmistakable sounds of someone walking through the underbrush. Loud crackling of breaking sticks and branches, but still. Everything is black. It gets closer and louder. But we don't see anyone coming. There's nothing. And all we can think is how it's basically suicide to trudge through these woods at night. Good way to get a stick in the eye at the very least. And eventually you will twist an ankle or break something when you step off a ledge. The ground around here is very uneven, but it's definitely someone coming. Crack. Snap. Snap. In the pitch black. Nope. We drive the hell out if there. We weren't afraid it was a ghost. We were afraid it was a person insane enough to be marching through the woods without a light. Do not want to meet that guy. Update. For those of you comforting yourself that it was just an animal, when I say, up north, I want you to imagine a place where you literally have to drive 3 hours to arrive at the closest city. And another 3 after that to get to the next one. And when I say noise, I'm not talking squirrels. Think rhythmic. And think large branches snapping on the ground. I'd been up there long enough to know what a possum sounds like. That big it might have been a bear. But a bear wandering around at night is not normal. Which I suppose means it would have been pretty messed up. And that makes it worse. Moose. Possibly, but those things are scarier than bears. No joke. They're the size of a truck. Use those antlers at anything that gets too close. And disappear into the woods like ghosts. But we didn't hear hooves, so. I've been locked inside a vast Gothic cathedral at night. Alone inside the structure, practicing the pipe organ for a forthcoming recital. During thunder and lightning storms, as I sat up high in the gallery at the console. Intense lightning flashes would cause the saints and other departed souls depicted in the stained glass windows to light up with such dramatic energy that it seemed as though they were about to step right out of the window and start roaming the cathedral nave. Even their stained glass jeweled eyes glowed with a fiery spirit of reality. As if they had resurrected at that very moment. I'm not sure this counts, but I'm a teacher at an urban public school and was at work late grading and getting ready for the next day. Time had kind of flown by, and before I knew it, it was 7 p.m. I start packing up to leave in a building that is, in theory, locked and empty besides me. When our Alice alarm goes off, indicating an armed intruder in the building. I am 1. Alone 2. Young 3. Freaked AF because I am absolutely not ready to fight a gunman over my lesson plans. I book it out of the school and dive into my car. Hearing the alarm blaring the entire time. I peel out the parking lot. And can see in my rear view the alarm lights still flashing and debate never going back. 'Cause fuck that LMAO. Turns out they were doing routine maintenance, and didn't send out an email to the teacher's woman facepalming light skin tone. I once delivered some soda to a grocery store in the middle of nowhere around 2010. Like an hour from any freeway. And the manager had at least 50 pictures of Burt Reynolds pinned up in her office. Does that count? I work remotely from home and sometimes I look in the mirror. Mostly the creepy things I see are just twitchy meth heads. Not work-related. But while I was living in rural Australia, I went to a swimming hole with some friends. You have to walk down a rainforest trail from the road for about 20 minutes to get to the swimming hole. There were no other cars parked near the trail when we got there. And we didn't see anyone else the entire time we were swimming. Anyway, we were there in the late afternoon and the sun was starting to go down. So we make our way back to where we parked our car. It gets dark by the time we make it to the road and we have out phones out as flashlights. Parked right next to our car is an old camper van. Lights are off and the side door is wide open with no one inside. There's no one around we can see, so we're kinda spooked and quickly get in our car and start driving. We get down the road a little bit and see headlights behind us. The road ends near the swimming hole, so it must be the camper van following us. Thankfully the lights turned down a side road before we got to the highway and we didn't see them again. Still wanted to check the car boot when we got home. Not for work, but I was at large old cottage in the middle of the Peak District. UK. With a friend whose parents lived there but were away for the weekend. For anyone that doesn't know, it's a very barren place. Full of hills. Heather and rains a lot. You don't see many people around. We'd spent the evening outside on her patio until it got dark and quite cold. So as we packing up to head indoors, her dog suddenly jumped upwards and just ran. As fast as I've ever seen it run into the field next door and into the darkness. No bark. No whining. Just vanished. We called and she eventually came back, but she kept turning around and standing her ground. Staring into the dark. A few minutes later we saw these flashes coming from a patch of woods beyond the field. They looked like camera flashes, but it was too far away to tell. 20 minutes later we were inside and we locked the doors. A little unnerved by whatever the dog had spotted. It was late. And too late for what happened next. The house phone rang. And at that kind of time of night. You know it's never good. But my friend just froze and looked at me. I asked her if she was going to answer it. The incessant sound of it already creeping me out. She said, "It only makes that noise when you've lost one of the handsets." I asked her what she meant. And she said, "We have 2 house phones. One here and one upstairs. It makes that noise when you phone the other phone if you've lost it. It's an internal call." Nothing came of it. But I didn't sleep much that night. I used to do salmon spawning surveys, which involved walking up streams looking for fish. Some of the streams are quite remote and/or inaccessible on timber land. And you don't really expect to see any other person when you're out there. As a naturally friendly, small feminine woman, I've learned to be wary of people 100% of the time in the field. I actively try to avoid running into people when I'm alone in remote places. One of the survey locations is close to a highway. To get to it, I had to park at a pullout, follow a river downstream to a flagged trail, hike over a ridge to meet up with an old logging road on private timber land. I walked along the logging road for about 100 meters before peeling off into the woods' very thick second-growth Douglas fir reprod, where game trails eventually lead to the stream at the base of the hill slope. I came here during spring to survey steelhead. But this stream was also a survey location for other types of salmon during the fall. The game trails off of the logging road were flagged by previous surveyors. And multiple routes were marked. This made it kind of confusing. And not all routes actually led to the stream. Some just petered out once the vegetation got too thick. Another led to a cliff face overlooking the riverbed. Lots of faint trails. One day I turned off into the woods, one of the survey flags tied around a branch at the side of the road. I followed some pink flagging heading south along the hillside. I noticed the trail seemed freshly turned up. And figured maybe a bear clambered through recently since the time I was there last 2 weeks previously. The trail led to a small claustrophobic clearing. And the ground was freshly torn up in the shape of a circle. Seemed strange. I was looking for elk tracks but didn't see any. Then I noticed an assortment of bones scattered around the edges of the clearing. These weren't there before. Everything was dead silent. And something about it was setting me on edge. I poked around the bones a bit, trying to piece together this scene. I noticed another slight path, which strayed from my main route, veering to the right from the clearing. I walked a bit down that way, and gazed ahead trying to see if this path was flagged. It was densely packed with trees. A subtle movement caught the corner of my eye ahead and to the right as I walked. I turned my head to look past the trees and saw the silhouette of a large shelter maybe about 50 to 75 feet from the clearing. It was surrounded by what looked to be jugs and bones. Tons of plastic jugs. Light shapes of bones on the ground. The lighting made seeing anything else impossible. Everything was so quiet. I left in a hurry. Off the trail. Without trying to get a better look. Without getting to the stream. The alarm bells in my brain were screaming. I don't work out in the woods or anything, but me and my dad were hunting in the Pacinos. So me and my dad were sitting in a hunting tower. It was cold as balls out and we start hearing what sounded like one of those old religious chants where they sing all together in Latin while walking in a straight line. It kept getting closer till we saw movement at 20 meters ahead, and then we saw a group of 10 to 30 people wearing all white holding candles, and then 5 more people with rifles and shotguns standing in the front, the back and on the sides. We let them pass and they were staring at us as they walked by. It was scary as all hell. 10 minutes after they walked by we went over to where they were standing, and it was snowy out there and there were 0 footsteps in the snow. Until this day we still don't know what the hell we saw that day. One night I was driving out on a remote country round and it was snowing pretty heavily. I got a call from my mom telling me to get home as there was a pretty large blizzard and the roads were only going to get worse. At 8:00 in the road I went to make a turn only to see someone standing in the middle of the road in a light hoodie. with no houses around for about a half-mile. I'm not sure why anyone would be walking out in a blizzard. As I swerved past, the person didn't flinch and looked right into my window. However, it was too dark to make out a face. It stopped snowing shortly after I got home, and the next day I went back out to the road to see if I could find any traces. I could clearly see my car tracks. But there were no footprints anywhere. It definitely could have been some cookout for a late-night hike. But it was still pretty creepy. I don't believe in ghosts. But I did see something once that I can't explain. And I have chalked it up to a trick of the brain. I used to work at a resort deep in Algonquin Park. It was basically rustic living for super rich people. It was a half-hour drive to cell service. And an hour drive to the nearest town. I finished my late shift at about midnight. And I was walking back to my cabin. I clearly saw an elderly man with suspenders and a plaid shirt walking by me on the path. We were not allowed to speak to the guests unless they spoke to us first, so I didn't say anything to him. It was pretty dark. I turned around to make sure he was headed the right way to the guest cabins. And he had straight up disappeared. There was nowhere for him to go except into the thick woods. And if he had done that, I would have heard it. Very strange. I used to work for an IT company in the gaming industry whose office was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farms and forest. One day one of the development team had come in from a walk in the forest and was visibly upset. Turns out she came across a dead fox. The thing that was concerning is that she said it was hanging from a tree and looks like it was put there on purpose. So a bit later on, a few of us went down to have a look. We came across a small clearing with the dead fox hanging there. Upon closer inspection, we realized it had been hung by its neck, with an incision from its balls to its throat and all of its insides pulled out. Felt pretty sick from that one. We got it down from the branch and chucked it into the bushes, away from the path and clearing. Still to this day we have no idea how or why it was in that state. I worked in Japan and there was a playground that was close to where I worked. I worked in a remote location, so it was kind of odd. The Japanese workers would always talk about how the playground was haunted because a bunch of kids died there during World War II. One night on my way into work I decided to stop at the playground to check it out. I noticed that the ambient air temperature in the playground was drastically colder when compared to what it was when I had the windows down driving. I stood still for a moment in the dark, just feeling the energy of the playground, and it was electric. I could feel my hair standing up. Maybe this was brought on by my imagination just giving me chills. On my way back to the car I could hear one of the swings squeaking as if it was being used. When I worked in a kennels up the mountains. In the depths of winter it would be dark by 5 p.m. I'd be in the office finishing up some paperwork. At this stage everyone would be gone, and this particular building was a bit away from the main building. Car park, etc. All the dogs would be sleeping by this time after a busy day. You could hear a pin drop. Sometimes I would hear heavy, definite, slow footsteps, so much so that I would get up, come out onto the main floor ready to explain we are now closed, but no one would be there. It used to freak me out. A couple of times. I would even check the dogs in case it was coming from a kennel, but nope, all sound asleep. Random people coming out of the woods is something you don't ever get used to, really. I grew up on a drilling rig my dad ran. When I was old enough to stand up and steer a pickup between hay bales I started doing that and pulling Wells oil well repair. With cell phones it's a lot less common, but vividly remember skipping rocks at a pond and meeting a few randos who broke down nearby looking for a ride. Man, I'm grabbing a blanket and some coffee for this thread. It's the perfect thread for this month. I used to work at a summer camp. Usually the kids would go to bed by 9 p.m. at the latest, so the rest of us would just hang out around a fire or something. One night one of the kids came to the fire pit, which was about 100 yards from the cabin, saying that she was having trouble sleeping because of the noise. So I walk back with her and make sure everything is good in the cabin and come back and tell everybody to keep it down. Maybe 10 minutes later she comes back and says that she still can't fall asleep. I walk back with her again, and in my head I'm thinking that she's just being restless because we aren't being loud. But anyways, I make sure she's under covers and head back to the fire pit. Just as I'm about to get there, I realize that I left my walkie-talkie in her room. So I head back and see that she's sitting upright in bed with the walkie-talkie in her hand. I'm thinking, okay, whatever, and tell her to go to sleep. I head back to the fire pit and the guys are like, "Why did you say that to her?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, "We heard you on the walkie-talkie tell her that she would look better if she shaved her head. That all little girls look better with shaved heads." I never said that and nobody believed me. And it was obviously not her saying it either, since it was a grown man's voice. I rushed back to check on the cabin and everything was normal. I was a Comcast cable installer. I went to this very strange house. From the front. It was a very long house. Ranch. Like a cigar shape. I walked in the front door into a long room. With a total of 7 doors. All of which were locked. The owner must have come through one of them to let me into this main big room. On the floor on the right. Was a large tube TV. The kind one might get for free from someone throwing it out. Or at a Goodwill. It was sitting on the floor. No furniture in this room at all. The man said to me I was not allowed to go any further in this house. Nor go into the basement to hook anything up. And that he had already hooked up the cable line in the basement up through the floor, and that all I needed to do was put in the small box and connect it. While doing this, a door opened. And there was a young boy with a very sad look on his face. His clothes were dirty. Tattered. And he looked hopeless. The man quickly snapped at him to lock the door. And the boy vanished as quickly as he opened the door. Suddenly the hair on my neck stood up and it felt like this was a trafficking pedo situation. There was no signal over the cable wire naturally. And I asked the man to get into the basement to check and he adamantly refused. I explained he would have no cable. And he said fine in an angrily tone and basically threw me out. It was super creepy. Deleted. Finding articles of clothing out in the bush is always alarming. I've spent quite a bit of time in remote areas both for my job wildland firefighter and recreationally. Never seen anything really weird. But the creepiest thing I've seen was near one of our prescribed burn units in the middle of nowhere. We used to regularly see the same truck out there driven by the most stereotypical creepy-looking dude you could think of. Always with a different much younger woman in the passenger seat. We of course reported him to local law enforcement, but I moved to a new job shortly after, so I don't know if anything ever came of it. I used to work on a shrimp trawler. Middle of the ocean. One night. It was a very bright moon. And kinda drizzling. Long story short. I saw a rainbow in the middle of the night. It was surreal. IDK if it counts, but my mum uses to live near a big forest, and sometimes when she would go into it as a kid to explore she would find wild pigs' heads on sticks. I work on North Sea oil rigs on an ad hoc basis off the coast of Scotland. Wouldn't say anything was particularly paranormal creepy, but it can be very unsettling, weird place. Fog can come rolling in out of nowhere and other rigs you can see off the sides can disappear in front of your eyes. Sometimes you can't see the walkways 6 feet in front of you, or if you're walking over grading you can't see the sea below your feet about 60 meters down from feck to sea, but you can hear it. Albeit muffled. The fog can roll in over the course of a few minutes too, so a perfectly clear day becomes pea soup. You can also feel the rig moving, swaying on high winds, rough seas. Even though it's a fixed-leg platform. Very unnerving to feel your office swaying when it shouldn't be. My last trip was my first ever night shift and I found it particularly unsettling as you've got the background noise of the plant, but I walked around the whole rig without seeing another living soul for the whole shift. Usually there are about 130 people on board, although smaller rigs have smaller headcounts. Usually once a trip I am hit by this awareness that you are just very isolated and in the middle of nowhere. Most rigs I've worked on are an hour's chopper ride from land. so if things go wrong it can escalate very quickly. During college that was located away from major cities. The woods were all around us. That being said, there was a highly rated trail. The Loyalsock Trail, which was about an hour drive from the university. I invited a friend to come with me as he had never been on an extended backpacking trip. A 50-plus mile trail that we intended to backpack over the 4-day weekend. I am an Eagle Scout who has spent countless hours in the woods and went on backpacking trips consistently throughout my college experience. As many have said before me, you get used to the minor, spooky, things happening. Coyote howls. Raccoons in the middle of the night. Even the occasional unknown noise. The scariest thing to find in the woods, however, are people. We were about 20 miles into the trail and, being Pennsylvania where the underbrush and trees line the trails pretty densely, I always walk about 100 meters off of the trail to reduce the chances of me disturbing people disturbing me, especially in the early morning when I choose to sleep in. Following that same strategy, my friend and I go out of our way to be in this amazing spot a good ways off of the trail where it would even be difficult to see our flashlights from the trail. This spot was on a peninsula where a creek met a river, meaning there was only one way into our camp and only one way out. We start a fire, cook our food, and drink some but not enough to get either of us drunk. We put the fire out about midnight and head into our individual tents. All is quiet. It is the fall semester. So leaves are on the ground. The moon is brightly shining through the bare trees. And the air is cool. The only noise is the occasional time when I would hear my friend turn over in his sleep. Then, I hear the voices. The voices sounded very close for being on the trail 100+ meters away. I check my watch. 3 a.m. Who hikes at 3 a.m.? We are 20 miles in. I slowly get out of my sleeping bag. Slowly unzip my tent. Only to see my friend peeking out of his tent in the exact same fashion. He quickly moves his finger over his mouth in an exaggerated, hush, signal. Then used the same hand to frantically motion towards the way of the trail. Then we see them. 4 adults. 3 men and 1 woman. Walking directly towards our camp. No lights illuminating their path. They are walking silently at this point. Only one of them has a backpack. An impossibility for the long hike. They were 1/3 of the way through. Being a long trip, you bring wood cutting supplies to chop branches into smaller branches to burn. For me, this was a survival knife. Grabbing the knife, believing it is my only way of defending myself. I am more disheveled than I ever have been. Especially knowing that a knife is barely defense at all. These people walk into our sight, sit down by our extinguished fire pit, and just sit there for what felt like an eternity. My friend speaks up and asks what they are doing in our campsite. Without answering the question, they ask if we have any food. Having packed as lightly as possible for the long trip, we had only a few extra Mountain House MRE-style meals. I grab one out of my bag and toss it to one of the men. In rapid succession, I ask why they aren't using a light, if they need help finding the trail, and why they are hiking so late. They respond with the following: 1. We don't use lights. 2. We know where the trail is. 3. It is better to hike late at night. Unnerved at this point, my friend asks them to leave. They respond by asking if we want to light the fire and hang out for a bit. No, we do not. They grab their bag, get up, and leave without speaking another word. We watch them leave and take shifts, making sure that they didn't come back. Needless to say, we both got very little sleep that night. When the sun rose the next morning, we finally got real sleep. By the afternoon, when we woke up, it all felt like a weird dream of sorts. The only evidence was a baseball cap that they must have dropped that I have to this day. I have never had something as weird, spooky as that happen in the woods and hope to never have it happen again. In the 8 years since that trip, I haven't been back to the Loyalsock Trail. I'm an avid hunter in a rural town in Missouri. My family hunts on public land and we have hunted on the same ridge for multiple generations. The land used to be kept by a large sawmill that used mules to drag the trees to the mill in the nearby town. We have found all sorts of crazy stuff. Railroad spikes in the middle of the woods. Horseshoes grown into the side of a tree where they hung it on a limb. One of the craziest things I've found in the woods was where a wagon had fell off the side of the ridge taking the mules with it. It's something like 200 feet drop, so they just left everything down there. I hiked by this thing 100 times going to and from our hunting spot. The woods all rotted from it, but the metal brackets and wheels were still there. Grown over and taken back by nature. One day while walking in the woods I get to my spot that is probably half a mile from that spot, and I've been sitting there for a few hours when I hear what sounds like people yelling down the ridge, followed by a loud scream. And a crashing sound. I grabbed my gear and start on my way out. When I get by where the wagon debris was, a flower wreath laid over the wagon, but I've never seen anyone down there except for my family members, and no one knows who put it there. We talked about that night back at camp, and we could only assume that if someone had died in that wagon, maybe it was some distant grandchild or something, and that day was the anniversary of it happening, but that still doesn't explain the sounds that I had heard. I still hunt down in the same place as always, but I've never heard or seen anything since. Out by the Kachemak Bay in the Cook Inlet, walking on the beach in the morning alone. A ways down the beach I found a skinned head of an otter, and further down the beach its skinned body. With only fur on its hands. Like perfectly cut. Turns out this was a poaching for fur situation, which is highly illegal. Let alone heartbreaking. A friend reported it when we got back into town. Used to be a supervisor for a janitorial company, and a couple times a week I had to go to a middle school and clean their hallway floors and gymnasium with a Zamboni-type vehicle that mopped and scrubbed the floor. When I was there I had the whole school to myself. Used to get finished quickly and go to the library and read while eating my dinner. Well, one morning after being there, I get a call from school security and they want me to come in. When I get there I see a police car too. Uh-oh. I think. They ask me a few questions like, "Did you notice anything out of the ordinary or strange while you were here last night?" No. I hadn't usually have headphones in. Security then shows me camera footage of someone breaking into one of the classrooms while I was riding the Zamboni not far away. I was there for another 2 hours. Nothing was stolen. But the worst part was they didn't have footage of the person leaving. They didn't go out the way they came in. And police had to sweep the entire school. Never did find out what happened with that one. While in the Marine Corps everyone has a story or heard someone who was out in the field and saw weird stuff on night vision goggles. I was in Kuwait near the Iraq border. It is the middle of nowhere. Miles and miles of sand. We saw some guy walking in the middle on the Nile. By himself. I have no clue where he was going or doing. My guess he was herding animals and lost one and was looking for. It is probably as likely that he was a ghost. A buddy of mine had a mine maintenance job for a summer. The mine was in the middle of nowhere and deactivated at the time. There was just one other person. A crusty old-timer. And they didn't really do anything but keep the weeds down. And make sure nothing was leaking or rusting out. It was a very low-key job. Twice a month a plane would fly in to deliver supplies. One day. About 3 months in. My friend was just walking along the river that ran near the site, and he heard what he swore was like a church choir and organ music in the distance. He was pretty sure that there was no settlement within 100 miles. But nevertheless he decided to try to find the source of the music. He wandered miles downstream following the river. But the sound never got any louder. Finally he decided to get the F back to camp. Because he'd wandered off really far in bear-infested woods without any protection. The music faded before he got back to camp. And he realized that it was such a peculiar experience he was reluctant to mention it to his coworker in case he thought he was crazy. The following day he did mention it. And asked if there was an Indian reserve or some other settlement with a church in area. His coworker replied, "No. Man. Nothing like that here, and I've been here 10 years. Looks like you're bushwhacked. You need to get out of here." He left on the next plane. My buddy went to Singapore for his military jungle training. He was woken up for his guard shift and noticed a foot-long very venomous centipede curled up on top of his sleeping bag. He was trying to stay calm. And then his ice for blood buddy reached down, grabbed the thing by the head, walked outside, and chucked it into the forest. Apparently the last thing he heard while the guy was walking outside with the little arthropod's head clamped in his fingers sounded like a hissing noise. I work on large ships. If you get a clear view of a hull or passage that runs the whole length, you can actually see the whole ship warp and twist with the sea. If the passage isn't very well lit, it can look like a scene from a horror movie. So in college, I'd wait for my roommate to get off of work at the new parking garage my campus built. He was a security guard on the night shift. Nothing too crazy most of the time, but one day he finished his shift and I told him I'd meet him outside. He leaves the garage and says, "I don't think you're going to believe me when I tell you this, but I have to tell someone while it's fresh in my mind." The next part is how I remember him telling me while we sat in the car. I was in the office chatting it up with the custodian when he pointed to the security camera screen and told me there's a guy in the stairwell. We both looked at the camera closely and sure enough, there's a guy just standing on a landing in the stairwell in an old-timey suit, bowler hat and everything. The security guard told me he'd start cleaning at the bottom of the stairs and if he saw the gentleman he'd tell him to leave. I told him I'd come up the landing and do the same. I didn't see him on my way to the landing, so I made my way to the stairs while calling out that the garage was closed for the night in case he was hiding. While walking through the stairwell, I startled the custodian because he was expecting to see Mr. Suit as well, but no one left the stairwell at the bottom. I told him I had to check out the rest of the grounds and that maybe he slipped out another way, even though there was really no way either of us could have missed him. I'm approaching the ramp of the next to last landing of the top of the garage and I see an older woman in an old-timey dress and umbrella. She's going up the ramp in the distance. I yell she shouldn't be up here and swiftly pick up the pace before I lose sight of her going to the top level. As soon as I arrive to the ramp, she was ascending. I don't see her. I got to the top of the ramp and see a kid skateboarding on the last level of the garage. I tell him the garage is closed and he shouldn't be up here. But at the same time wondering where that woman went. The skateboarder apologized and said he'd walk down with me if that would be okay. We get to the bottom and I say, "Hey man, you see anything weird at this garage tonight?" The skateboarder looked at me with the most confusing stare and said, "Well, there was this older woman standing at the edge of the garage and I didn't see her come up the ramp." I screamed she should be careful not to get too close to the edge. I went to pick up my board and when I looked up, she was gone. I ran to the edge to see if she jumped, but nothing. She was gone. She was wearing this old-looking dress and umbrella. I didn't want to tell the kid I saw the exact same woman because I was too freaked out. I suggested that it was probably a costume party and some people were messing around. I couldn't explain the disappearances though. He said he thought the same thing, but he remembered his boss telling him that years ago 20s-era people would dress up in their Sunday duds and walk through the park in town. The park was right where this parking garage was. I don't work in a remote place, but I have a house out in the middle of nowhere that I rarely ever get to see. The town has a population of roughly 30–40 people, all of whom have acres and acres between each other. My in-laws who live nearby have been noticing at least 2 or 3 of their chickens missing every other day and assumed it was a fox. The usual. Anyway, one night myself and my wife are doing a bit of work on our fences around our land and we hear this thrumming noise coming from the adjacent acreage, which is completely overgrown. You can't even see through it, let alone walk through it. The only way I can describe it is like a cat purring. But you know, a fucking massive cat. The entire bushland seemed to reverberate with the sound. Needless to say, we made a hasty retreat and try not to go out at night when we're there. More so than we did before due to all the undiscovered mines. I collect data on electrical systems, power lines, poles, transformers, etc. My last project spent a lot of time in the high Rockies. Most of my days were spent far from cell phone service and society. We often joked about being stalked by mountain lions only to lighten the mood because we were probably constantly being stalked by mountain lions. I work in a secure area in the forest, and I once saw two troops of monkeys having a war and watched as one group realized halfway they could kill the other much faster by throwing their rivals at the barbed wire. I do a lot of stream work, so I spend time out in pretty rural areas walking streams and rivers. Once my coworker and I were working in a more urban environment and came across what we initially thought was a body. Which of course triggered, "Oh shit," from us. But it ended up being a firefighter's dummy that had fallen down a hill. We felt pretty dumb. Other notable things include a small grave in the middle of nowhere for someone's dog, pretty sad. And a stuffed rabbit with shotgun shells placed where its eyes should be. A mannequin very purposely placed in a chair in the middle of the woods. And lots of little random altars. I also did work in Myrtle Beach, what a hellhole, and accidentally walked into an inhabited homeless camp. I was peering into a stormwater grate when I looked up and saw a homeless person standing in his shelter staring at us and saying nothing. I felt like I was trespassing, so we quietly left. As a prior deer hunter, I can tell you that the thundering noises from a squirrel can sound like a herd of elephants when out in the woods while all is still and quiet. If it's pitch black out, then power lines will glow in the dark while it's raining. A huge amount of hair laying outside. Like someone had cut off an entire ponytail. Right outside of camp on the ground. Turned out to be from a musk ox. They're so cute. Very hairy. I used to work as a tree planter and have spent thousands of hours in the deep woods. To be honest, there is nothing creepy in the forest other than carcasses and the sound of animals. But I will always say that the forest is alive and you need to respect it, because in the woods, you're on nature's terms. If you don't, the forest will disrespect you back. It is very easy to become lost and disoriented without a compass. And there are many perils that the woods can manifest to injure, maim, or kill you. Don't fuck with the woods. I'm a geophysicist and I'm out to do survey work about 1/3 of the time. A lot of our surveys are in remote locations. I was doing one in my home province of Saskatchewan. Very far north. About a 6-hour drive from the nearest small town. And then a 45 minutes helicopter ride into our camp. It's isolated. And this survey began in October of last year. So it's quite dark a lot of the time. My room was on the attic of our only building. And the wood-burning stove that heated the place was directly below my room. So I often had to leave the window open at night. One night I had the window open and I could hear singing from outside. Which was creepy, but I figured it was just a member of the crew who can't sleep. The next night I hear the same thing. At the same time about 3 a.m., and this time I get up to go to the bathroom. Everyone else was sleeping in cots in a large open room, and when I'm heading back to my room I realize that everyone is in their cots. I don't hear the singing again for a few days and it stops creeping me out. Until about a week later. I wake up and hear it. I go to check and once again everyone is in their cots. I put my huge winter jacket on. I head outside and walk towards the sound. I step right up to the shore of the lake that we're on and I hear it coming from somewhere across the lake. The moon is up and very bright. And I see somebody in the lake. Which is absolutely freezing. As in it has started to ice over. At this point I am terrified, but I call out in case they needed help. They dive down under the water and I don't see them ever again or hear the singing. It feels like a dream to this day. What the fuck? Archaeologist here. We had found a rural graveyard on USFS land in the middle of some mountain foothills in Nevada. And had started recording some features of the site. We noticed there were these creepy little porcelain angel figures on top of the graves. Meaning that these were not super old graves, or at least were being somewhat maintained. We didn't have enough time to finish before sundown. So we wrapped it up and headed back to the bunkhouse. When we came back Monday to finish the site, all the angels had been systematically covered by old cow patties. Like someone was trying to hide them from us. That meant, people had been watching us that Friday afternoon. Unbeknownst to USB people didn't want us there, we called the USFS archaeologist we had been working with. And she told us to finish and leave as quickly as possible. These are my favorite AskReddit posts. Alien. In -92 I worked in Tambua, Angola. This is in the middle of nowhere. They were so poor there that they buried their dead babies in the sand just outside the houses. I could see several handkerchiefs, towels buried partly. And I knew what was under it. I felt so sorry for them. I grew up on a farm in West Texas. So lived and worked would probably be most accurate. With all that flat, cleared land we saw stuff in the sky all the time. Mostly meteors and orbiting satellites. And every now and then a satellite whose orbit decayed and fell to Earth. Those are the prettiest. Their mass makes them streak longer before fizzling out, and the metals inside make all sorts of hues when burning up. I have seen a lot. But my dad is like a magnet to the strange and fantastic. When he was a kid, he saw a Cold War strategic bomber be struck by lightning and fall in a fireball to the ground. Right before I was born. He was out hunting and saw a blood-red sky in the east at 3 in the morning. And when I was a teenager, out hunting with him, he saw a line of silent blue lights outside our campground, which unnerved him so badly we almost left for home right then. Unfortunately, I did not get out of my sleeping bag to see. My dad is also a notorious prankster. And I thought it was another one of his gags. On one hand, I hope I see something like his encounters someday. On the other, I kind of hope I don't. My cousin was a deepwater diver welder on offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. When working at night or working really deep, it is absolutely pitch dark. You can't see anything. That in itself is a little creepy. To add to the uneasiness, he said that sometimes he would be hit with a big swirl of water as if something very large, very close, just passed by him in the blackness. Now, let's take it up another notch. Sometimes he would feel something brush up against his leg or nudge him. He said his imagination would wander. And never to a good place. Totally creeped him out every time. I worked at a public forest. One day we had someone report a dead animal on the side of one of our trails. A few of us from the front desk hiked out to see what it was. It looked like a giant piece of liver, maybe. Just a pile of smooth red meat, no blood around. And it was wrapped up in a t-shirt, with some coins scattered around it. We called our rangers to go check it out. And one of them was pretty sure it was a placenta. The weird part is, you have to check in through a front desk. So someone either snuck a placenta liver in or gave live birth, removed an organ on our trails. We never got an answer on what the pile of meat was. How it got there. Or why. Back when I delivered pizzas in my small college town, I used to have to deliver to some pretty remote places. One weeknight I was delivering to a house which was about a mile outside our delivery range. But it was a slow night and I was saving up tips for a trip in the summer, so I told my boss I would do it. The house was near impossible to find. It was deep in the woods. Dark outside. And the driveway was completely overgrown. There was very little cell service too. So my GPS wasn't functioning properly. I passed it 4 times before seeing a very hidden mailbox which indicated the house. I got out of my car and went to the front door. Knocked a few times but no answer. It didn't look like there were any lights on in the house, but the window blinds were drawn so it was hard to tell. I could clearly hear what sounded like someone running up and down the stairs over and over. I thought it might be a dog at first. But there was no barking. After about a few minutes of this, I began to feel something was off and became extremely aware of how dark it was. How quiet it was. And how remote I was right now. I determined this dude's shitty tip wasn't worth the agita and decided to head back. I turned back to my car, screamed, and dropped the pizza. There was a kid, probably about 12 to 13, sitting on the hood of my car. I have no earthly idea where he came from. He had on a light gray hoodie which combined with the darkness gave him the look of a specter. I picked up the pizza and gathered myself, and yelled out asking if he lived here and ordered the pizza. The kid immediately jumped off my hood and sprinted into the woods, away from the house. I got in the car ready to nope the fuck out. When I reversed out of the driveway, right before I pulled into the street, I saw the kid emerge from the woods again and stand on the driveway, watching me leave. I got back to the store and told my boss what happened. He was angry I didn't make more of an attempt to deliver the pizza, but I talked him into calling the house to confirm the order. No one picked up after 4 attempts. My boss stopped accepting calls outside our delivery zone after that. More so out of not wasting his driver's time more than our safety dude was an ass. We never got a call from that house again for the remaining 2 months I worked there. I was working at a ski lodge. We closed the bar down for the night, and I sent everybody home. I was in the office, doing some paperwork, when I heard a noise like a collision, and so I thought I better investigate. I pulled on a snowsuit and grabbed a flashlight, and headed out the back door. I think it was about -10 degrees before the wind chill. Behind the lodge was a lake. So I started walking across this frozen lake, flashlight in hand. Just me, a beam of light, and the snowflakes. In cold weather, in a place like that, noise can carry a very long distance. I walked maybe a quarter to a half of a mile before I found the bodies. It was a snowmobile collision. 2 drunks, high speed, and there was snowmobile debris everywhere. I was able to get these guys back to the lodge on the remains of one of the snowmobiles, and call for emergency services, which took about 45 minutes because we were in a remote location. Not work related, but about 7 years ago I was at home reading some comics when suddenly the phone rang me. Picks up the phone random lady at the other end. Are you Delta? Me. What? Silence. Lady hangs up. That was in the middle of the night and happened when I was 8. Still creeped the fuck out of me. I'll see this on YouTube as a TTS video tomorrow, no doubt. Hi Reddit aliens. I grew up in San Jose, California. My friends had Jeeps. SJ as sounded by foothills. Well, we would trespass all the time. One time we are in the middle on the Santa Cruz foothills, on some flat part of a hill taking a piss. It's like 2 a.m. and we hear some lady singing in a weird language. And it went on for a bit, so my friend was done taking a leak. He's standing by the Jeep and the small trees and bushes shake, and this younger woman comes walking through holding a baby. And she was rubbing the baby's head. All weird. I couldn't tell if the baby was alive, but she walked right past us like we weren't there. It was next level creepy. I have a story from the opposite perspective. I sometimes go on night hikes, especially when there's a full moon. I also have great endurance, and I've been known to hike all night. I was on a winter night hike in a national forest, very far from a marked trail, and following game trails whenever possible. I saw a flashlight shine briefly through the trees, about a quarter mile up ahead. I'd hiked this area dozens of times, and I had never seen anyone out there, much less at 2 a.m. I began following the light. After about 20 minutes, I heard voices. It sounded like 2 women, and they were arguing about something. As I got closer, I heard that they were arguing about being lost and cold. I should also note that it was bitterly cold out, and I had on a ski mask and was covered in multiple layers of clothing. I realized that the women were walking towards me, and I didn't want to scare them, so I stopped walking and waited for them to come to me. Hearing footsteps approaching in the dark can be unnerving, and I didn't want them to panic. I heard their footsteps getting closer and saw their flashlight approaching. Finally they were within arm's reach. So in my friendliest tone of voice, I said, "Good morning." They did not find my greeting friendly at all. And in fact, screamed bloody murder, dropped the flashlight, and started running in the opposite direction. One of the women apparently twisted her ankle and looked back at me with absolute horror, crying out for her friend to help her. Her friend didn't even slow down and practically sprinted away. I asked, "Are you okay?" but she probably couldn't hear me over her screaming and desperate scramble to crawl away from me. I still hadn't moved. And the fallen friend realized she wasn't in immediate danger of being murdered. To make a long story short, I ended up making a crutch for the woman with the twisted ankle and I guided them both to their car. They later told me I looked like an evil shadow blocking their path because I was wearing all black with the moon behind me. Oops.